Grand Admiral Threxus Val watched his flagship's bridge crew die in silence, one console at a time, and understood, far too late, that the warning painted across every star chart bordering Terran space had never been a bluff. The Dominion's Reach was the pride of the Solvane Imperium, a warship 3 kilometers of armored hate that had cracked open 40 worlds without losing a single major engagement. It had entered the Terran exclusion zone with its guns hot and its admiral confident, expecting to find the same soft, sentimental species every Imperial intelligence report described. Generous, apologetic, hopelessly reluctant to use the terrifying weapons rumors said they possessed. Threxus had read those reports personally. He had laughed at them. He was not laughing now. Every screen on his bridge showed the same impossible thing: 41 Imperial warships, the entire vanguard of the invasion fleet, going dark within the span of 90 seconds. Not destroyed, not boarded, simply switched off, as though some vast, patient hand had reached across the void and pressed a single button. His own ship's reactor alarms were screaming a diagnostic his engineers couldn't explain. Something inside the Dominion's Reach had stopped obeying its own crew. Admiral. His communications officer's voice cracked with something between awe and terror. Incoming transmission. Human military designation. The face that appeared on the main screen did not belong to a diplomat or a politician. It belonged to a tired, gray-eyed woman in a plain gray uniform, sitting in a command chair that looked almost insultingly modest compared to the gilded thrones of Imperial flag officers. "Admiral Val," she said, and her voice carried no anger, no triumph, only the flat patience of someone repeating a lesson to a student who refused to learn it the first time. The warning wasn't a threat. It was a courtesy. "You should have listened." Threxus opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time in 40 years of service, that he had absolutely nothing to say, but none of this had begun that way. 6 days earlier, the Solvane Imperium hadn't even known Earth's exact coordinates. The Imperium had spent 3 centuries devouring the galaxy's smaller powers under the banner of the Unity Doctrine. The elegant, endlessly repeated lie that conquest was mercy, that lesser species were better off folded into imperial order than left to squabble amongst themselves. Grand Admiral Threxus Val had built his entire career on that doctrine. He believed it the way other men believed in gravity, not as an opinion, but as a law of nature too obvious to question. Humanity had appeared in imperial records only 11 years earlier, flagged by a border scout as an unremarkable species occupying a single, unimportant system on the galaxy's rim. The scout's report noted, almost as an afterthought, a single strange anomaly: an enormous perimeter of unmanned buoys ringing human territory, each one broadcasting the same message in over 60 galactic languages. "You are approaching Terran space. Turn back. This is the only warning you will receive." No demands, no threats of retaliation, no boastful claims of overwhelming force. Imperial analysts had studied the message for months and concluded, unanimously, that it was almost certainly a bluff. The kind of empty bravado a weak, frightened species used to disguise how little it actually had to defend itself with. Threxus had agreed with that assessment completely. He would spend the rest of his life regretting it. "They have no psionic academies," his chief strategist, a sharp-featured officer named Colonel Irena Das, had told him during the final invasion briefing. "No gravitic weapons platforms. Their fastest ships are decades behind our own drive technology. By every metric we use to measure military strength, they should not be capable of stopping us." And yet, Threxus had said, tapping the star chart where the warning buoys glowed in defiant amber, "Someone believes they can." Irena had hesitated, a small crack in her usual certainty that Threxus noted, and, in his arrogance, dismissed. "Confidence isn't the same as capability, Admiral." She would remember saying those words for the rest of her career, and she would never say anything so foolish again. What Threxus didn't know, what almost no one in the Imperial fleet knew, was that humanity's warning buoys had not been designed by the same admirals and generals the Imperium expected to find on the other side of any battlefield. They had been designed by a small, mostly civilian research division that answered to no military chain of command at all, a fact that would only become clear after the invasion had already failed. Sarah Okonkwo had not always been a fleet commander. 8 years earlier, she had been a systems engineer working on early warning infrastructure for a species still haunted by memories of its own century of wars. Wars fought with nuclear fire and city-leveling bombs. Wars that had taught humanity a lesson no other species in the galaxy seemed to have learned yet: that the only reliable way to avoid a catastrophic fight was to make the cost of starting one so obvious that no rational actor would try. She had pitched the buoy network to a skeptical defense council as a deterrent, not a weapon. Something that would let any approaching force see exactly what they were walking into before a single shot was fired. "You're building a wall that only works if they choose to read it," one council member had argued. "That's the entire point," Sarah had answered. "We're not interested in ambushing anyone. We want them to have every opportunity to turn around with their pride intact. If they don't take it, that's their choice, not our failure." The council had approved the project on the condition that it never be used offensively, only to disable, delay, and warn. Sarah had spent 6 years making sure it could do exactly that, down to the smallest technical detail, and had never once expected to be sitting in a command chair the day it was finally tested against a real invasion fleet. The invasion fleet crossed into the exclusion zone at dawn. By the imperial calendar, 41 warships in tight formation, banners of conquest streaming from every hull in ceremonial defiance of the warning they'd been given. Threxus stood at the Dominion's Reach command dais, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to imagine the triumph waiting on the other side of this campaign. Another world folded into the Unity doctrine. Another medal, another step toward the rank of Fleet Marshal he'd coveted his entire life. That was when the first buoy detonated, not with weapons fire, but with a burst of encoded transmission so dense it briefly overloaded every sensor array in the fleet. "Report!" Threxus barked. "Sir!" "It's not an attack," his sensor officer said, bewildered. "It's a data packet, massive. It's Admiral, it's routing directly into our navigational systems." Nobody understood what that meant until the engines began to fail. The truth stunned the entire fleet within minutes. The humans hadn't built a wall of warships to stop the Imperium. They had built something far stranger and far more dangerous: an adaptive electronic warfare network, woven into the buoy perimeter itself, capable of reading an approaching fleet's own broadcast signatures and turning their systems against them from the inside. It wasn't psionics, it wasn't gravitic weaponry. It was code, patient and merciless, built by a species the Imperium had spent a decade dismissing as primitive. Threxus watched, helpless, as ship after ship in his formation went dark, their crews trapped in vessels that no longer answered to them. His own flagship held out longest, its systems fighting the intrusion inch by inch, buying him just enough time to receive the transmission that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "My name is Fleet Commander Sarah Okonkwo," the gray-eyed woman said, once the channel opened. "You crossed a line we drew in good faith, Admiral. We don't want this fight, we never wanted it. But we prepared for it anyway, because history taught us that mercy without strength is just an invitation." "This is piracy," Threxus snarled, some shred of imperial pride refusing to die quietly. "You have crippled 41 ships without firing a single shot. Where is your honor in that?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Where was yours, when you drew up invasion plans for a species you'd never even spoken to?" That silenced him more thoroughly than any weapon could have. Everything changed in the next few seconds, because that was when Colonel Irena Das, watching from her own crippled cruiser, 41 warships dead in space around her, her career and her doctrine and everything she'd believed about Imperial supremacy unraveling in real time, did something no Sylvain officer had done in 3 centuries of conquest. She opened a private channel and asked to negotiate. Threxus would later call it treason. History would call it the only intelligent decision made by anyone in the Imperial fleet that day. "We were wrong," Irena said quietly, when Sarah Okonkwo's face appeared on her screen, "about what your species is, about what this warning meant. I'm not asking for mercy for myself, I'm asking you not to let this become a war neither of our peoples can walk back from." Sarah studied her for a long moment, Not with triumph, but with something that looked almost like sympathy. "We're not going to destroy your ships, Colonel. We never intended to. Every system we disabled can be restored the moment your fleet withdraws from our territory. This was never meant to be a massacre. It was meant to be a lesson you'd survive to remember." Nobody knew what the human fleet was hiding until that moment. No counterattack was coming. No boarding parties. No triumphant execution of a defeated enemy. Just a quiet, devastating demonstration of exactly how thoroughly the Imperium had misjudged its opponent, paired with an offer of restraint that no conquering power in Solvane history would ever have extended to a defeated foe. The Council back on the Imperial homeworld had made a terrible mistake in authorizing this invasion without a single human diplomat ever being consulted, and the fallout would not stay contained to one battlefield. Within hours of the fleet's crippled withdrawal, encrypted transmissions reached every Imperial listening post along the border, carrying Sarah Okonkwo's voice and a single unambiguous message to the Solvane throne. Humanity did not want an empire, it wanted to be left alone, and it had just proven without spilling a drop of Imperial blood that it could enforce that wish against the mightiest war fleet the galaxy had ever built. Threxus Val returned home in disgrace, stripped of his rank, his 40 years of conquest reduced to a single humiliating footnote in Imperial history. But it was Irena Das, demoted, disavowed, and quietly reassigned to a border research post, who would go on to write the report that changed everything. A formal recommendation that the Imperium abandon the unity doctrine entirely in dealings with Earth, not out of fear, but out of something far rarer among conquerors, respect, honestly earned. Sarah Okonkwo never received a medal for what happened that day. She didn't request one. When a journalist asked her, months later, why humanity had built a warning system, instead of simply hiding its strength and striking first, her answer was carried across 1,000 worlds, and remembered long after the Imperium itself began to change. "Because the goal was never to win a war," she said. "It was to make sure one never had to happen. We gave them every chance to walk away with their dignity intact. That they didn't take it isn't a failure on our part. It's just the truth about who we are. We'd rather earn peace the hard way than take a war we could have prevented." Colonel Irena Das kept a copy of that interview for the rest of her career. Long after her reassignment to the border research post became a quiet, permanent posting she never tried to escape. She would show it, years later, to junior officers who arrived at her outpost, still carrying the same certainty she'd once carried herself. The belief that strength alone decided who deserved to rule and who deserved to be ruled over. "Read the whole thing," she would tell them. "Then tell me who actually won that day." Most of them, in time, came to the same conclusion she had: that the Imperium had lost far more than 41 crippled warships on the edge of Terran space. It had lost the last comfortable excuse for believing conquest was mercy. Humanity had never fired a single shot, had never taken a single Imperial life, and had still delivered a defeat so complete that the unity doctrine itself did not survive the decade that followed. Threxus Val never spoke publicly about the invasion again. But in the years before his death, stripped of rank and largely forgotten by the Empire he'd once served with unshakable conviction, he wrote a single private letter to Sarah Okonkwo, one she kept, unanswered, in a drawer in her office for the rest of her life. It read simply, "You were right, and I am sorry it took losing everything to understand why." She never replied. She didn't need to. The silence between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a war that never happened said everything the galaxy needed to hear.